Lawyers of Reddit, how do you argue without crying? Story 1. I've only cried once during a sentencing hearing when I was a prosecutor. It had to do with a mother selling her 11-year-old to a bunch of men. But the rest of it, you save it for before or after. Typically, you get angry or anxious or worried during hearings not teary. Story 2. It's less about crying from the running the case argument, and more about the stress and sadness of the subject matter. But for the most part, cases aren't two lawyers having a heated argument with each other. They're just factual legal submissions, often aggressively delivered, to try convince a judge or jury to favor their side. Story 3. Law school teaches you to only care about the facts and not so much the emotions surrounding it. Once your brain is trained for a legal formula, it's easier to argue without being affected by emotion. Plus, eventually you become cynical and numb, and most stuff doesn't bother you anymore. Story 4. My husband is an attorney for family law and does a fair deal of cases involving child abuse. He doesn't cry during argument, before or after. He just never sleeps. Story 5. The only cases I've cried were 2 pro bono asylum cases I worked on. Pro bono is like volunteer work. One was tears of joy, the other very much tears of sorrow. And regarding the arguing bit, I don't work in an emotional area of law. Sure, I've worked hard to craft my arguments to their strongest point possible, but at the end of the day, whether I win or lose my client is still likely going to be insanely rich. No one's rights have been trampled. It's tough to get super attached in my cases. Also, most of my arguing has already been done on paper multiple times, so I have an idea how all parties will be reacting ahead of time. Story 6. I was on a jury once in a murder case. The accused had the odds stacked against him, but in the end, the prosecutor just couldn't push things over the beyond a reasonable doubt hurdle, and we acquitted the accused man. The guy had a female public defender for a lawyer. When the verdict was read, she broke down and cried. She had worked hard for her client, but I don't believe even she thought she would get him off. All of us jurors felt that the guy actually probably did do it. The prosecutor's case just had too many holes. We all agreed that we felt like we needed to go home and take a shower. Story 7. Hubby is a barrister. He's pretty unemotional. Says you learn quickly to cut yourself off emotionally from a case, otherwise it affects your judgment. Story 8. My mom said she did cry, just not in court. Rough days, she'd go to her car on lunch break and let it all out. It was effective, but very hard on her. Story 9. In civil cases, contract disputes, personal injury, there isn't much to cry over. It's mostly paperwork. I do a fair bit of family litigation, and there isn't really a good guy versus bad guy. It's always shades of gray. The system works best, and the law develops properly when each side brings their best arguments on the evidence. People get emotional in family law, especially custody, but it's not your problem. You simply work with the facts your client has and advance the best argument you can. Story 10. Arguing during litigation is different from just arguing. You're focused on remembering the law, listening to what's being said and argued on the other side, and formulating a response. Because it's your job to do so, there isn't much room to be emotional. I save the crying for my office, car, shower, pretty much anywhere but the courtroom. Story 11. Lol, I'm not a lawyer, just a professional at arguing. You just gotta remember nobody in that argument gives about your feelings. You seem there to cry, you are there to destroy. Story 12. You cry when you're learning about the case, or when you're drafting the papers, or once you're out the courtroom, but never in front of your clients or the magistrate's judges. You have a job to do, and most people don't cry at work in front of others. Story 13. I self-repped in family court during a very bitter divorce custody battle. My ex was doing everything she could to ruin my relationship with my kids. One thing we had was baseball. I coached their little league games. My daughter, 9 at the time, is smaller than most kids her age, terrible at bat, nervous about everything. I worked with her a lot and built up her confidence. Finally, one game she connected with the ball and made it to first base. Next batter, she got to second. Next batter, she got to third. Next batter, she crossed home. My shy, quiet daughter was a completely different person as she celebrated her first baseball run, and her mother chose to keep her away from all her baseball games when the kids were with her just to spite me. Telling the story of my daughter's first baseball run in court, it was impossible to hold back my tears. Even the court clerk was in tears. I eventually got a court order that her mom had to get her to all her little league games. Story 14. What do you mean by argue without crying? Do you cry when you argue? Because I don't think it is abnormal for them to not cry when arguing. It is more abnormal to cry when arguing. Story 15, I mean. I'm not a lawyer, but I've never cried during an argument unless I was so super emotionally invested in it. It's hard to be that emotionally invested in something you do every day for a living. Story 16. I've been a public defender for about 20 years. There are times I need to stop my arguments and compose myself. There are also times I cry on my way back to my office or after work. I guess my answer is that I don't argue without crying so much as I put off crying until I'm done. Some cases are tougher than others. Story 17. Practice. When you start doing audiences is hard, but with time you became used to it. It's funny. To me, the feeling is almost like to separate myself of what I'm doing. It's a form of blinding myself. But at home later. Depending if the thing is hard, I have some cases that are still hunting me years after what happened, especially in what concerns family law. Story 18. A lot of comments seem to gloss over what I perceive as an important part of the OP's question. How do lawyers cope with constant confrontation, adversarial relationships, questioning of one's character and honesty, being told you're being unreasonable, etc.? Some areas of law have less of this. If you're a transactional lawyer, you have disagreements with the other parties, but everyone's trying to get to the same place and make a deal happen. Many criminal cases may not be particularly adversarial either. Most end with a plea bargain that is just a negotiation over the charges and the strength of the evidence, without any real dispute to the underlying facts. For example, you're caught on camera stealing, or a K-9 found drugs in your car. Working with regulatory agencies can be similar. You might just be working with a bureaucrat to make sure the forms get filled out right. Family law is among the worst. It's insanely emotional, and every aspect of every case is a bitter fight to the death. Want an extension of 48 hours to file your brief? Go to. Immigration asylum cases are similar. Everything is wrapped in human tragedy. Many criminal cases are extremely hard on the lawyers, as folks have detailed in this thread. But even run-of-the-mill cases with an unemotional subject matter can take a heavy toll on the lawyer. Even if you do something boring or that's just paperwork like patent law or contract disputes, your relationship with opposing counsel can make it grueling. I've had lawyers accuse me of lying, withholding documents, treat me suspiciously, yell at me, call me unprofessional, question my intelligence, question my ethics. To my face, over the phone, via email, in court, on the record and depositions, you name it. I've been compared to Hitler. How do lawyers cope? In my experience, a lot of them drink. As many as 1 in 5 lawyers is a problem drinker, twice the national rate. I've seen a lot of folks take out the stress on their families, but the divorce rate among lawyers as a whole is lower than you'd expect. Drug abuse is much more common than you'd think for folks who have an ethical and professional obligation to be law-abiding citizens. In my personal life, I am not a confrontational person, and I pride myself on making people feel welcome, being able to talk to anyone at a party comfortably, making polite small talk with strangers, and generally being a nice, laid-back, agreeable dude. At work, I have to put on a different persona of someone who is thick-skinned, callous, professional, robotic. If I have a confrontational call, I'll need to take time to calm down and recenter myself. If I have a rough deposition or day in court, I have to exercise or meditate to purge it, or it will ruin my evening. Sometimes I can't open important emails after business hours, because if I do, it will ruin my family time and my evening or my night of sleep. I've dealt with panic attacks my whole life. Never in court, always after. There's no off button or truly off the clock in my job. It is a constant daily struggle to keep the stress and emotions in check. And for me, it's impossible to be perfect at stopping myself from taking things personally. Story 19. I am reminded of Sir Ivor Jennings's remarks in Constitution Making in Arcady. In the English tradition, all lawyers are brothers. They could not fight each other so fiercely and dine together afterwards if they were not. Story 20. Keep in mind, even if we get contentious in that courtroom, we walk right out and shake hands with opposing counsel and discuss plans to get our families together. It's not an emotional form of argument usually. It's a job, and we usually use reasoning. If it looks like emotional argument, usually the emotional part is a performance, like being in a play to get the result we want. You cannot equate it with arguments you have in your daily life. Story 21. For me, the reason I don't cry while arguing is simple. The process isn't meant to be adversarial. I hate arguments where it's personal and confrontational, and that is usually what makes people cry. You go, make your case, present your research on legal precedent and how it ties into the facts of your case, and hope the judge understands what you meant to say and agrees. Also, the nerves, anxiety of putting your point across well and not sounding stupid or unprepared, has been a really intense factor for me, and the feeling of being on the spot takes over and doesn't leave room for any other emotions. Story 22, family lawyer here. Personally, I often express frustration with tears and disagreements in my day-to-day life. Professionally, this frustration manifests normally, since it usually stems from annoyances and ridiculous tactics used by other lawyers. I often find it amusing when an opposing counsel uses personal attacks and ridiculous tactics because I am just dumbfounded by the approach. It is incredibly rare to get into a back-and-forth heated argument with an opposing counsel or party. When it does happen, it's usually in the hallway during a break or before submissions are made. My usual response is to distance myself, as these kinds of discussions are not productive and are actually a disservice to the client if we engage. I can say that I have been given some very poor decisions by judges in different applications. These have usually been related to protection orders, domestic violence, or when a judge refuses to actually read the materials provided, having already made their mind up about the decision. I have had to fight back an emotional response numerous times in front of a judge after learning the hard way at the very beginning of my career that disputing a decision made by a judge in front of said judge will cause them to get quite upset with you and potentially tarnish their view of you for future cases of yours. We never know when we will be in front of the same judge again, so mastering your emotions in that room is paramount to your future success, and frankly, your reputation if you are presenting in an open court in front of other lawyers, the public, your client, and possibly their family. This is a learned response that becomes second nature with time. Outward expressions of frustration, sadness, defeat. These are generally shown to our friends, spouses, and coworkers at our firms only. People pay us to stay solid. Don't get me wrong. I've cried with a client less than a handful of times based on the heartbreaking nature of the situation, abduction, abuse, etc. Time and a place, though.